tried adding double embossing to your paper crafts? You can easily combine dry and heat embossing to create fun and stylish embossed cards with that extra step that takes your cards up a notch. Heat embossing allows you to add colour and highlight dry embossing, and there are many ways you can do that. Today I'm showing you how you can create 4 cards with 3 different techniques. As always, there's so many colour combinations you can go with due to a whole range of colour powders at your disposal. I'm Verity from the creative team and welcome to the channel. The first technique combines heat embossing with embossing folders as the dry embossing aspect. Embossing folders have 2 sides, one that has a small raised areas of the design pattern and the other side with small recessed areas of the design pattern. For the first card, we're going to use the side that has the raised design pattern. This will emboss into the card, but if we add embossing ink onto the folder prior to dry embossing, we can create a faux letterpress look. So I'm adding clear, ultra slow drying embossing ink from WOW to the side with the raised design pattern. Make sure you lightly tap the pad down to transfer the ink onto the folder. Do not smush or press down hard, as this is going to transfer ink to the folder in the areas around the design pattern where we don't want it to. I placed a piece of tranquil teal cardstock from Gina K Designs into my folder and closed it shut, and then run this through my die cutting machine with my sandwich set up for embossing folders. Next, I covered the debossed side where the pattern is pressed inwards with metallic gold rich pale embossing powder from WOW. As the ink was only on the raised areas of the folder, the powder will only stick to the debossed areas where the ink was transferred to. So I used my dual speed heat gun from WOW to heat set the powder, and you end up with this beautiful faux letterpress debossed design. So to finish this card off, I added a sentiment from the fine alphabet dies from Oceanic out of white cardstock and white foam for dimension. A sentiment from the Reason to Smile stamp set from Oceanic was then heat embossed in matching gold powder and foam mounted onto the card. Lastly, I added a few gold sequins from a sequin mix from Lucy's Cards. For the second card, I used the alternative side of the embossing folder. So this time I added embossing ink to the side where the design pattern is recessed into the folder, and you have a large area of raised plastic. So you want to apply the ink to this raised area. So using my ink pad, I swiped the pad over the side of the folder, and you don't need to worry about getting ink into the recessed areas when you do this, so you can use a swiping motion. Repeat the process of running this through your die cutting machine with your cardstock. This time add the embossing powder to the embossed side where the design pattern is raised. The ink will have transferred to the areas of the cardstock around that embossed design pattern. So once you've heat set this, you get a lovely metallic embossed background with the dry embossed design remaining as the coloured cardstock. Again, to finish this card, I created another sentiment with the alphabet dies out of matching card and added these to corresponding letters cut out of white foam for dimension. I added a smaller stamp sentiment in Daydream ink by Catherine Pooler, and once more finished the card with some gold sequins from Lucy's Cards. So both of these cards use an embossing folder to transfer your embossing ink to add some heat embossing detail to your dry embossed areas. For the second technique, we're going to create double embossing using stencils. So to do this, you need to tape your stencil down to your card panel, and I'm using the Spring Garden stencil by Oceanic. To dry emboss the stencil, you need to use a rubber embossing mat. So this is a flexible mat to run through your die cutting machine. You could also use a sheet of fun foam. Now place your card and your stencil onto your embossing mat and place a cutting mat over the top. You need to run this through your die cutting machine as though it's set up to emboss your dies. So just refer to your die cutting machine's manual to work out what sandwich you need. You may also need to add a few shims to your sandwich depending on your machine and how much pressure it gives. When this comes out of your machine, you will see that your stencil design has then embossed into your cardstock. But before we remove the stencil, we are going to add some embossing ink over the stencil so we can add some heat embossing. Now I wanted to add a heart mask to add a shaped design to my heat embossing. And so I placed this down and then smooshed my ink pad down over the stencil to transfer the ink. Then I removed the stencil and covered this with embossing powder. So I'm using Long Island Teal embossing glitter. To heat set embossing glitter, it's really useful and best to heat from underneath. This allows your embossing powder to start to melt and it will trap your glitter in it. But if you heat from the top, your gun will blow away some of the glitter before the powder's had a chance to melt and trap the glitter in it. To accentuate the shaped design more, I added the heart design back over the top to ink blend It's a Boy Catherine Pooler ink over the top. So the embossing powder is going to resist this ink and just colour the background of that shape. My ink blending brushes had some leftover yellow on them, so I ended up with a more teal aqua colour rather than the light blue It's a Boy should be, but it ties in quite well with the colour scheme. The card panel was added to a card base made out of tranquil teal cardstock, and again I finished this card off with a sentiment using the same alphabet dies. The heat embossing sentiment added was from the Thinking of You stamp set from Oceanic, and I used Oceanic embossing powder from WOW. Finally, I added a few sequins from Trinity Stamps to finish the card off. This technique is great for adding detail to soft, subtle dry embossing from stenciling, and masking your heat embossing allows the emboss pattern to continue with more subtle tone-on-tone dry embossing for a continuous look. For the last technique, we're going to use dies to dry emboss and then heat emboss as well. So I'm using a couple of dies from Altenew's Layered Rose die set and grouped these in a way that was quite pleasing to the eye. To dry emboss the dies, we use the same sandwich as before when we emboss the stencil, but you won't use any of the shims because you don't want them to cause the die to start cutting into your cardstock or create cracking of the cardstock. Before you place the dies onto your card, we can add embossing ink to the die's cutting edge. So as with the first card, just apply the ink very lightly, tapping the pad down. You don't want to smush or press hard as this is going to transfer ink to areas of the die we don't want, and we only want to apply the ink to the cutting edge of the die design. Place your dies onto your cardstock with your cutting edge facing down. I did this over on my machine to the side so I didn't have to worry that whilst I was transferring my card over to the machine, the dies would move and transfer ink all over the place. Carefully remove your dies and cover with powder. The powder will adhere to the ink in the recessed design where the die has embossed into the cardstock. And for this card I used the Oceanic embossing powder, which is a lovely dark blue teal. The first time I did this, I got a small amount of rippling in my cardstock with my embossing mat. So I redid the panel, but I didn't want to waste the embossing I'd done. So I used the coordinating dies to cut out the flower and the two leaves. So after the card panel had been added to a card base made out of tranquil teal cardstock, I could foam mount the flower and leaves on to the card panel for added dimension. Another sentiment was added with the alphabet dies, and I used rich gold pale to heat emboss the secondary sentiment. So this technique can allow you to stretch your dies to double emboss, and the heat embossing highlights the fine detail design of the dies. All three techniques have their own ways to add heat embossing to dry embossing, whether it's fine highlight details when using dies to emboss, or bold metallic backgrounds, or a faux letterpress embossing when using embossing folders, or selective heat embossing to accentuate subtle dry embossing from stencils. You can get a whole range of looks to suit any style of crafting and for any occasion. So make sure you have a go and try a couple of these techniques out. I hope you enjoyed today's video. Please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to hit that bell icon to be notified when the next video is up. If you'd like to check out my personal channel, Pretty Little Button, I've also included a link here as well as down below. If you're not a subscriber already, why not click that button below along with the bell icon to be notified when my next video is up. Also check out this other video for more inspiration. Until next time, happy crafting!